Blood is thicker than water, but money? Money is the acid that dissolves both. I spent 30 years trying to be the perfect daughter, only to watch my parents steal my grandfather's inheritance to fund my brother's lies. So, I took them to court and I destroyed them. If you looked at a photograph of the Charlotte family from the outside, you would see the epitome of Chicago suburban success. My father, Mason Charlotte, was a senior partner at a mid-sized accounting firm. My mother, Beatrice, was a prominent figure on every charity gala committee in the North Shore. And then there were the children, my older brother Preston and me, Ava. From the moment I could understand human dynamics, I knew I was playing a rigged game. Preston was the golden child, a boy whose mere existence was celebrated as a triumph. He was handsome, incredibly charismatic, and possessed a silver tongue that could talk him out of any consequence. When Preston crashed his brand new BMW at 19 because he was driving under the influence, my parents hired the best defense attorney in Illinois, buried the charges, and bought him an Audi as an apology for the stressful ordeal. I, on the other hand, was the invisible daughter. I was the straight-A student, the rule follower, the one who worked a part-time job at a local coffee shop just to have my own spending money, because asking my parents always came with a lecture on financial responsibility, a lecture Preston conspicuously never received. The only person who truly saw me was my grandfather, William Charlotte. Grandpa William was a self-made man who built a successful logistics company from nothing. He saw right through Preston's charm and my parents' blatant favoritism. Before he passed away when I was 22, he took me aside. "Ava," he had said, his voice raspy but firm, "your father is a fool when it comes to that boy. I've set up an irrevocable trust. It's split equally between you and Preston. However, you cannot access the principal until your 30th birthdays. I'm doing this because I know you'll use your 20s to build character, and I'm hoping Preston will use his to grow up." He made my father the trustee. That was Grandpa William's fatal mistake. He assumed his son would honor his dying wishes. Fast forward 8 years. I was approaching my 30th birthday. I had spent my 20s exactly as my grandfather hoped. I paid my way through architecture school with scholarships and loans, deliberately refusing any financial help from my parents to maintain my independence. I was now a junior partner at a boutique architectural firm in downtown Chicago, and I had big plans. My half of the trust was valued at roughly $1.2 million. I had spent 2 years drawing up business plans to start my own firm. The money wasn't just cash to me. It was my freedom. It was the foundation of my future. Preston's 20s predictably were a disaster. He bounced from one revolutionary startup idea to the next, always needing seed money, always failing spectacularly. There was the app for luxury dog walkers, the boutique imported tequila brand, the bespoke concierge service. Every single one went bankrupt, quietly bailed out by Mason and Beatrice. 3 days before my 30th birthday, my parents invited me to dinner at the Capitol Grill downtown. I assumed it was a birthday celebration. I wore my best dress, brought them a vintage bottle of wine as a thank you for the dinner, and walked into the restaurant feeling a rare sense of familial warmth. We sat in a private booth. My father ordered a $300 bottle of Cabernet. My mother was overly affectionate, touching my arm, complimenting my hair. I should have known something was wrong. The Charlottes were never affectionate unless they were hiding something. As the steaks were cleared away, my father cleared his throat, adjusting his expensive silk tie. "Ava, sweetheart, we need to discuss the William Charlotte Trust." "Of course," I smiled, taking a sip of wine. "I've already spoken to a wealth manager. I'm planning to transfer my half into a new business account next week to secure the lease on the new office space." My father didn't meet my eyes. He looked at his water glass. My mother reached across the table and grabbed my hand, her grip uncomfortably tight. "Ava," Beatrice said, her voice dripping with that practiced condescending sympathy she used at her charity galas. "We've had to make some restructuring decisions regarding the family assets. For the good of the family." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Restructuring? What does that mean?" "It's an irrevocable trust, Dad. My half becomes legally mine on Thursday." Mason finally looked up, his jaw set in a defensive line. 2 years ago, Preston got involved in some bad investments. Real estate in Dubai. It went south, Ava. Very south. He was facing personal bankruptcy, potential fraud charges. He was in debt to some very unforgiving creditors. "Okay," I said, my heart starting to pound a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "And what does Preston's incompetence have to do with my trust?" "We didn't have the liquid cash to cover it," Mason stated bluntly, dropping the facade of gentle parenting. "I had to use my power as the trustee to access the principal of the William Charlotte Trust to settle Preston's debts and keep him out of federal prison." I sat perfectly still. The ambient noise of the restaurant, the clinking silverware, the low hum of conversation faded into a high-pitched ringing in my ears. "You used his half," I whispered, praying I was misunderstanding. "His half wasn't enough," Beatrice interjected, tears welling up in our eyes, crocodile tears, expertly deployed. "We had to use the entire trust, Ava. Your half, too. We had no choice. He is your brother. We had to save him." "You stole my money," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "You stole $1.2 million from me to pay off Preston's gambling, or whatever the hell Dubai real estate is code for." "Don't use that word," my father snapped, his face flushing red. "I am the trustee. I made a fiduciary decision to protect the family name. If Preston went to jail, it would have ruined my career, your mother's reputation, everything. We will pay you back eventually. You're doing so well, Ava. You have a good job. You don't need that money right now like Preston did." I pulled my hand out of my mother's grasp as if her skin was burning me. I looked at the two people who had brought me into this world, and I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, terrifying clarity. They didn't see me as a daughter. I was just collateral damage to them, a sacrifice they were perfectly willing to make on the altar of Preston. I stood up, threw $100 bill on the table for my share of the tip, and looked my father dead in the eye. "You will hear from my lawyer," I said quietly. "Oh, don't be so dramatic, Ava." My mother hissed, looking around nervously to see if anyone was watching. "You wouldn't sue your own family." "Watch me," I replied, and walked out into the cold Chicago night. The next 48 hours were a blur of grief, rage, and manic research. I didn't sleep. I paced my apartment, drinking pots of black coffee, scouring the internet for everything I could find on trust law, fiduciary duty, and Preston's alleged Dubai real estate venture. My father was a shrewd accountant. He wasn't stupid enough to just wire money out of a trust directly to a bookie or a foreign bank account. He would have created a paper trail to make it look like a legitimate investment made by the trust itself. But an irrevocable trust has strict rules. A trustee must act in the best interest of the beneficiaries. Plundering one beneficiary's share to save another from criminal charges was a massive, illegal breach of that duty. But I needed proof, and I needed a shark. Enter Gregory Davies. Gregory was a senior partner at a formidable litigation firm in the Loop. He was 65, sharp as a tack, and had a reputation for tearing opposing counsel apart with a polite smile. I managed to get a consultation by cashing in a massive favor from a client of my architecture firm. Sitting in his glass-walled office overlooking Lake Michigan, I laid out the facts. I handed over a copy of my grandfather's will, the original trust documents, and the notes I had taken during the horrific dinner at the Capitol Grill. Gregory listened in silence, his fingers steepled under his chin. When I finished, he let out a low whistle. "Your father," Gregory said, his voice a gravelly baritone, "is incredibly arrogant. He assumed that because you are his daughter, you would just absorb the loss. He banked on familial guilt to cover up a textbook case of embezzlement." "Can we prove it?" I asked, my hands shaking slightly. "Oh, we can do more than prove it, Ava," Gregory smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "We can subpoena the trust's financial records. As a beneficiary, you have a legal right to a full accounting of the trust. If he refuses, a judge will compel him. But before we file, I have my own private investigator look into things. If your brother was moving millions to Dubai, there are footprints. I authorized the retainer, draining my personal savings to do it. I was all in. If I lost, I would be bankrupt. But it wasn't about the money anymore. It was about justice. It was about my grandfather's memory." A week later, Gregory called me back into his office. He didn't look politely amused anymore. He looked deeply disgusted. "Sit down, Ava," he said, pushing a thick manila folder across the mahogany desk. "My investigator Richard has been digging into Preston, Charlotte, and a shell company called Apex Ventures. Your father claimed the trust money was used to settle debts to keep Preston out of jail, correct?" "Yes, a failed real estate venture in Dubai." Gregory opened the folder and pulled out a stack of glossy photographs. "This," he said, tapping the top photo, "is a 60-foot Sunseeker yacht currently docked in Miami. It is named the Silver Lining. It is registered to a Delaware LLC, which is wholly owned by Apex Ventures." I stared at the picture of the sleek, gleaming boat. "I don't understand. Your father didn't just bail Preston out," Gregory explained, his voice hard. "According to the financial trails we've uncovered, approximately $800,000 went to actually paying off creditors. The remaining $1.6 million, including almost your entire share of the inheritance, was invested into Apex Ventures. So my father," I trailed off, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "Your father funneled your inheritance into a fake company controlled by Preston. Preston then used your grandfather's money to buy a luxury yacht and a waterfront condo in Miami. Your brother isn't broke, Ava. He's living like a king on your dime, and your parents orchestrated the whole thing. The betrayal was so profound it knocked the wind out of me. It was one thing to sacrifice my money to save my brother's life. It was a sick, twisted logic, but I could almost comprehend it through the lens of my parents' pathological enablement. But this wasn't a rescue. This was a robbery. They stole my future to fund Preston's vacation." "What do we do?" I asked, my voice deadly calm. "We don't just sue for the return of the funds," Gregory said, leaning forward. "We sue Mason Charlotte for breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and embezzlement. We sue Preston Charlotte for unjust enrichment and civil conspiracy. We freeze the assets of Apex Ventures. We put a lien on the yacht and the condo. And, if the judge agrees with our assessment of the fraud, we push for punitive damages and refer your father to the state licensing board. He could lose his CBA license." "Do it," I said without a second of hesitation. "Burn it all down." 2 weeks later, the legal nuclear bomb was dropped. Process servers found my father at his accounting firm, handing him a lawsuit thick enough to choke a horse right in the middle of a partners' meeting. Another server tracked Preston down to a VIP cabana in South Beach, Miami, handing him his papers while he was drinking a $400 bottle of champagne. My phone started blowing up exactly 3 hours later. First it was my mother, call after call, 22 missed calls in the span of an hour. Then the texts started rolling in. "Ava, what are you doing? Have you lost your mind? Call your father immediately. You're tearing this family apart. How could you do this to us?" Please, sweetheart, let's talk about this. Don't let lawyers ruin our family. I blocked her number. Then I blocked my father. Then I blocked Preston. I packed a bag, handed my apartment keys to my best friend to check on my cat, and rented a secluded cabin in Wisconsin for a week. I needed to brace myself for the war that was about to begin. Because I knew my parents, they would never admit fault. They would hire their own expensive lawyers, they would lie, and they would try to paint me as the greedy, ungrateful daughter. But they had no idea what was coming. They thought I was still the quiet, invisible girl who would just take the scraps they threw at me. They were about to find out that Grandpa William had left me a lot more than just money. He had left me his spine. When I returned to Chicago from my week in Wisconsin, the battlefield had been drawn. My father, true to his arrogant nature, didn't hire a mediator or try to settle quietly. He hired Harrison Caldwell, a notoriously aggressive defense attorney known for dragging out civil litigation until the plaintiff went bankrupt from legal fees. Their strategy was clear: bleed me dry, stall the discovery process, and force me to drop the suit. But they underestimated Gregory Davies, and more importantly, they underestimated how much of Grandpa William's stubborn blood ran in my veins. The first major confrontation happened 3 months later during my father's deposition. We were seated in a sterile, glass-paneled conference room high above the Chicago River. My father wore a bespoke navy suit, looking every inch the respectable senior partner. He refused to look at me. My mother wasn't permitted in the room, which I knew was driving her insane out in the waiting area. Harrison Caldwell started by trying to establish a narrative that I was financially unstable and that Mason, as a loving father and fiduciary, was simply managing the trust to protect the family from my brother's unfortunate but temporary liquidity crisis. "Mr. Charlotte," Gregory began, his voice dangerously smooth as he clicked a pen. "You stated that the transfer of $1.6 million to Apex Ventures was an investment to generate returns for the trust. Is that correct?" "Yes," my father replied smoothly. "Real estate in emerging markets. It was a calculated risk, but entirely within my purview as trustee." I see," Gregory said, pulling a stack of papers from his briefcase. "And how exactly does a 60-foot Sunseeker yacht docked in Biscayne Bay generate a return for the William Charlotte Trust?" My father's jaw tightened. The vessel was intended to be chartered. It was a business asset. "A business asset," Gregory repeated, sliding a document across the table. "This is the flight log for a private charter from O'Hare to Miami over the 4th of July weekend. The passengers listed are Preston Charlotte, his girlfriend Brittany Hayes, and 4 other individuals. There is no record of any charter fee paid to Apex Ventures. Furthermore, here is the Instagram feed of Miss Hayes, geo-tagged on the silver lining, holding a bottle of Dom Perignon with the caption, 'Hubby's new toy.'" Permanently, Gregory leaned in, dropping the polite facade. "Tell me, Mason, does the trust routinely purchase luxury watercraft for your son to host frat parties under the guise of an emerging market investment?" Caldwell immediately objected, but the damage was done. My father's face was the color of old brick. For the first time in my life, I saw Mason Charlotte sweat. During the lunch break, I went to the restroom to splash cold water on my face. When I stepped out of the stall, my mother, Beatrice, was standing by the sinks, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. "Ava," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please. You're destroying your father. He hasn't slept in weeks. The stress is killing him. If this goes to trial, it will be in the papers. He'll lose his partnership." I looked at her through the mirror. He should have thought about that before he stole my future to buy Preston a yacht. "It's just money," she hissed, her composure cracking, revealing the ugly desperation beneath. "You can make more money. You're smart." Preston Preston needs us. He's fragile. He's 32 years old, Mom. He's not fragile. He's a parasite, and you and Dad are the hosts. I dried my hands, tossed the paper towel in the bin, and walked out without looking back. But the real turning point of the case didn't happen in that deposition room. It happened a week later at a dimly lit coffee shop in Lincoln Park. I received an unexpected text from an unknown number. I know what they did. I have the receipts. Meet me at Bourgeois Pig Cafe. Come alone. I brought Gregory's private investigator, Richard, who sat discreetly 2 tables away. I slid into a back booth across from Brittany Hayes, Preston's now ex-girlfriend. She looked exhausted, her designer sunglasses pushing back messy blonde hair. "Preston dumped me," she said bluntly, wrapping her manicured hands around a mug of green tea. "He found some 22-year-old Instagram model in South Beach. Kicked me out of the condo on Brickell Avenue." "I'm sorry," I said, though I honestly couldn't muster much sympathy. "Don't be. He's a monster. But your dad is worse." Brittany reached into her oversized tote bag and pulled out a sleek silver flash drive. She slid it across the table. "Preston gets sloppy when he drinks. He left his laptop unlocked. I downloaded everything before I packed my bags." I stared at the drive. "What's on this?" Brittany smiled, a bitter, sharp expression. "The truth. Preston didn't have unforgiving creditors. He wasn't going to jail. It was a scam. And your father was in on it from the beginning. The files on Brittany's flash drive were the equivalent of a legal nuclear strike. It turned out my father wasn't just blindly enabling Preston. Mason Charlotte had a secret of his own. He had been quietly skimming money from his own accounting firm's clients for years, covering his tracks with complex shell companies. He needed a place to park his illicit funds, and a luxury condo in Miami was the perfect offshore-adjacent asset. The emails between my father and brother detailed the entire conspiracy. Mason instructed Preston to fabricate a massive debt. Mason then used his power as trustee to drain my grandfather's trust, paying off this fake debt by funneling the money into Apex Ventures. Preston got the yacht as a bribe for his cooperation, but the $4 million penthouse on Brickell Avenue? That was Mason's retirement plan. And the most shocking twist of all, Mason had a mistress in Miami. The penthouse was their love nest. Gregory didn't even wait for the next scheduled hearing. He filed an emergency motion in front of Judge Thomas Abernathy at the Cook County Courthouse, presenting the newly acquired emails and financial ledgers as evidence of massive, coordinated fraud. The emergency hearing was a closed-door bloodbath. Harrison Caldwell, upon seeing the emails, immediately filed a motion to withdraw as my father's counsel, citing an irreconcilable breakdown in attorney-client communication, lawyer speak, for my client lied to me, and are not going down with this ship. Judge Abernathy, a no-nonsense jurist with a terrifyingly quiet voice, reviewed the documents in silence for 10 agonizing minutes. When he finally looked up, his gaze pinned my father to his chair. "Mr. Charlotte," the judge said softly, "in my 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen a fiduciary breach so brazen, so meticulously planned, and so morally bankrupt. You did not merely mismanage your daughter's inheritance. You actively conspired to defraud her to fund a lavish, illicit lifestyle." Tough. My father opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. He looked small, old, and utterly broken. "I am issuing an immediate injunction," Judge Abernathy continued. "All assets tied to Apex Ventures, including the Miami real estate and the marine vessel, are hereby frozen and ordered to be liquidated. The proceeds will be transferred back to the William Charlotte Trust. Furthermore, I am forwarding a transcript of this hearing, along with Plaintiff's Exhibit C, the email chains to the Illinois Board of Examiners and the state's attorney's office for criminal investigation regarding potential embezzlement from your accounting firm. In the gallery behind us, my mother let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She hadn't known about the mistress. She hadn't known about the stolen client funds. She thought she was protecting a troubled son, only to find out her husband had orchestrated a criminal conspiracy to fund a secret life. The family imploded right there in the marble hallway of the courthouse. Beatrice slapped Mason across the face so hard the sound echoed off the high ceilings. Preston, who had flown in for the hearing, tried to sneak toward the elevators, only to be cornered by two state investigators who'd been waiting outside the courtroom doors. I stood next to Gregory, watching the chaos unfold. I felt no joy, no triumphant vindication, just a deep, profound exhaustion and a strange sense of peace. The cancer had been cut out. It took 8 months for the assets to be fully liquidated, because the yacht and condo had appreciated in value, and because Judge Abernathy awarded me treble damages and full legal fees. I didn't just get my $1.2 million back. The final wire transfer to my secure, newly established business account was just shy of $2.4 million. Mason Charlotte was stripped of his CPA license, fired from his firm, and eventually pleaded guilty to federal wire fraud. He is currently serving a 5-year sentence in a minimum security facility in Indiana. Beatrice filed for divorce and had to sell the suburban house to pay off the restitution Mason owed his clients. She now lives in a tiny condo in the suburbs, socially exiled from the charity circuits she once ruled. Preston, entirely cut off from his parents' money and facing his own conspiracy charges, ended up taking a plea deal for probation. The last I heard, he was working at a car wash in Fort Lauderdale. I never spoke to any of them again. When my mother tried to call me from a blocked number on my 31st birthday, begging for a fresh start, I simply hung up and changed my phone number. Instead, I took my grandfather's money and did exactly what he wanted me to do. I opened Charlotte & Blas Architectural Design in a beautiful, sunlit loft in the West Loop. We just secured our first major commercial contract last week. Sometimes late at night, I look at the framed blueprints on my office wall. I think about my grandfather, a man who saw the rot in his own son and tried to protect me from it. Blood might be thicker than water, but it's also toxic if it's poison. I had to amputate my entire family to survive. But standing in the firm I built with my own 2 hands, I know I made the right choice. I'm no longer the invisible daughter. I am the architect of my own life. Family betrayal is the deepest wound, but sometimes walking away is the only way to build the life you truly deserve. Ava turned a devastating loss into an empire. What would you do if your own parents sacrificed your future for a sibling? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, please hit that like button, share it, and subscribe for more real-life drama.